Snow fell quietly over a Chicago city park. An elderly woman sat alone in a broken wheelchair. No coat, no gloves. Her hands were shaking in the cold. A police officer slowed his patrol. His canine stopped and growled. Not at her, at the footprints leading away. No one knew this abandoned grandmother was about to expose a hidden betrayal, and no one knew this dog would become part of a miracle only God could explain. Dogs are truly God's angels without wings. Type amen if you believe this meeting was not an accident. Snow fell heavily over Grant Park, turning the heart of Chicago into a white, breathless void where sound softened, distance blurred, and the cold crept into everything that dared to remain still. Under a dim street lamp, Eleanor Whitman sat alone in her wheelchair, a figure so still she seemed carved from the night itself. She was 70 years old, though the years had pressed on her unevenly, some with quiet patience, others with blunt cruelty. Her shoulders slumped forward, not from sleep, but from the slow surrender of muscles that had learned too often that no one was coming. The wheelchair beneath her was old, its metal frame scratched raw and flecked with rust. One wheel stiff and crooked, locked at an angle that forced the chair to lean slightly left, as if even it had grown tired of standing straight. Eleanor's hands were bare, fingers thin and trembling, the skin pale and mottled, veins raised like blue threads beneath parchment. She wore no coat, no gloves, only a torn long-sleeve shirt that clung damply to her body and a pair of ragged pants smeared with dirt and slush. The fabric had once been soft, maybe even neat, but now it hung from her frame like an apology that had gone unanswered. Her hair, once carefully kept, was a mess of silver strands tangled by wind and neglect, sticking to her tear-streaked cheeks. Deep wrinkles framed her mouth and eyes, not the gentle kind carved by laughter, but the sharp lines left by years of endurance. Tears slid down her face without sound, freezing halfway before they could fall, as if even grief hesitated in this cold. Eleanor did not sob. She had learned long ago that crying loudly did not bring people back. Instead, she stared at the snow-covered path ahead of her, watching it empty itself again and again, waiting for a familiar shape that never appeared. She told herself, not for the first time, that Mark would return. Yeah, her grandson had said he would. Mark Whitman, 32, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair always neatly combed and a smile that appeared easily when others were watching. To strangers, he looked dependable, the kind of man people trusted instinctively. To Eleanor, he had been something more complicated, loving in bursts, distant in between, impatient when life slowed to her pace. He had pushed her wheelchair here earlier that evening, speaking gently, even cheerfully, about fresh air and how it might help her sleep. Why, he had taken her phone to keep it from getting cold, slipped her wallet into his jacket for safekeeping, and promised he would be right back. 5 minutes, he'd said. Just 5. Time had passed differently since then. Minutes stretched into something shapeless, the cold erasing edges, dulling sensation, until Eleanor could no longer feel her feet. She tried once to move the chair herself, but the rusted wheel refused to turn, locking her in place like a verdict. Eventually, even panic grew tired, leaving behind a quiet, heavier fear, the kind that whispers not that you will die, but that no one will notice when you do. The silence broke with a bark. It was sharp, sudden, and alive, slicing through the muffled hush of snowfall. Eleanor flinched, her head lifting slightly. Another bark followed, closer now, urgent. A German shepherd burst into view, large and muscular, his black and tan coat dusted with snow, ears upright and alert. Yeah, he moved with purpose, every step controlled, trained. His name was Shadow, and he was 6 years old, seasoned by countless patrols, intelligent in the way that came from constant vigilance. His amber eyes locked onto Eleanor instantly, not with curiosity, but recognition. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The leash snapped taut as his handler followed. Officer Daniel Carter ran into the pool of lamplight, boots crunching against the frozen path. He was 30, tall and solidly built, with squared shoulders and a posture shaped by years of discipline. His dark navy winter uniform was heavy and insulated, collar raised against the wind, badge catching the light as he moved. He wore no hat, exposing short-cropped brown hair already dusted white with snow. His face was angular, jaw set, light stubble shadowing his cheeks, not careless, but the kind that came from long shifts and little sleep. Daniel's eyes were steady, observant, the eyes of a man who had learned not to look away from difficult things. He slowed when he saw Eleanor, breath catching almost imperceptibly. Training took over, but something else stirred beneath it. Anger, quiet and controlled. He knelt in front of her, careful not to startle her, already reaching for his radio as he took in the details. The bare hands, the torn clothes, the blue tint creeping into her lips. "Ma'am," he said gently, voice low and firm, "can you hear me?" Before Eleanor could answer, Shadow growled. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was a warning. Shadow turned sharply, body tense, eyes fixed on the dark tree line behind the path. Daniel froze, instincts flaring. He followed the dog's gaze and saw what Shadow had sensed first. Fresh footprints cutting across the snow, not yet softened by falling flakes, leading away from the lamplight and disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Daniel slowly stood, at one hand tightening on the leash, the other hovering near his radio. His breath fogged in the cold as he scanned the darkness, pulse steady but alert. Whoever had left Eleanor here might not be gone after all. Somewhere beyond the trees, the snow shifted again, and the night watched back. Wrapped in a foil emergency blanket that crackled softly with every breath, Eleanor Whitman spoke in fragments, each sentence a small effort wrestled from the cold that still clung to her bones. Her voice was thin but steady, the kind that came from years of learning how to make herself understood without demanding attention. She told Officer Daniel Carter about Mark, her only grandson, Mark Whitman Howe. He had wheeled her into Grant Park earlier that evening with a gentleness that felt rehearsed. So Mark was 32, tall and broad in the shoulders, dark hair kept neat, beard trimmed just enough to look responsible without appearing careless. He smiled easily when it suited him, especially in public, and spoke to Eleanor with a softness that vanished the moment patience was required. He said the air would help her sleep, that she looked pale, that 5 minutes outside would do her good. He took her phone so the battery wouldn't drain in the cold, slipped her wallet into his coat for safekeeping, and pushed her toward a darker stretch of the path where the wind died down. "I'll be right back," he'd said, voice warm, eyes already scanning elsewhere. 5 minutes. Then he turned and walked away. Time, Eleanor explained, lost its meaning after that. The cold did strange things to memory. At first, she counted breaths, then footsteps that never came. She tried to move the chair, but the left wheel refused to turn, grinding uselessly against frozen slush. Panic flared once. sharp and bright, then dulled into something heavier and quieter. She remembered thinking that if she screamed, no one would hear her over the wind. If she cried, no one would stop. So she waited, watching snow gather on the path like a slow erasure, wondering when exactly a promise became a lie. Daniel listened without interrupting, jaw tight, eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. He had learned long ago that people told the truth more clearly when they weren't rushed. That lesson came from a night early in his career, years before Chicago, when a domestic call ended with a child hurt because Daniel had trusted calm words over visible fear. Since then, he had learned to read what wasn't said. Eleanor's story wasn't confusion. It was chronology. It was intent. Shadow lay pressed against her legs, his body warm and solid, breathing slow, his ears flicking at every sound beyond the lamplight. He wasn't resting, he was guarding. The ambulance arrived with lights muted, tires hissing against snow. Paramedic Sarah Morales stepped out first, tall and lean, her movements efficient despite the slick ground. She was in her late 30s, olive skin flushed from the cold, dark hair pulled into a tight bun beneath her knit cap. Sarah's eyes were sharp but kind, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and still chosen to care. She knelt beside Eleanor, speaking softly as she checked vitals, her gloved hands practiced and warm. "You're safe now," she said, not as reassurance, but as fact. Eleanor nodded, tears slipping again, this time from relief as much as pain. As Sarah and her partner prepared the stretcher, Daniel stepped a few paces back with Shadow, eyes drifting to the tree line where the footprints disappeared. The tracks were still clean, edges sharp. Whoever made them hadn't gone far before the snowfall thinned. Daniel keyed his radio, voice low, requesting a quiet canvas of the surrounding paths and parking areas. No sirens, no announcements. If Mark Whitman was still nearby, Daniel didn't want to spook him. In the ambulance, Eleanor's breathing steadied. She clutched the edge of the blanket, fingers still trembling, and asked Daniel if Mark would come back. The question landed harder than any accusation. Daniel met her gaze and chose his words carefully. "We're going to make sure you're taken care of," he said. "Right now, that's what matters." Eleanor nodded again, accepting the answer she was given, even if it wasn't the one she hoped for. Outside, Shadow's posture changed subtly as the ambulance doors closed. His head lifted, nostrils flaring, attention drawn toward the parking lot beyond the trees. Daniel felt it too, a shift in the air, a sense that the story wasn't finished with them yet. He tightened his grip on the leash, eyes scanning the rows of snow-dusted cars, breath measured, heart steady. A promise had been broken tonight, but broken promises had a way of leaving traces behind. The ambulance pulled away toward the hospital, red lights swallowed quickly by falling snow. Daniel stood for a moment longer in the quiet that followed. Shadow at his side, both of them facing the dark where Eleanor had been left to disappear. Somewhere nearby, someone had walked away, believing the cold would do the rest. They were wrong. The Southside Hospital smelled of disinfectant and old heat, the kind of place where winter never quite let go, even indoors. Eleanor Whitman slept beneath warmed blankets, color slowly returning to her cheeks, while machines hummed softly at her bedside. Officer Daniel Carter stood just outside the room, hands folded behind his back, posture rigid with restraint. He had learned to wait, to let facts surface before anger did its damage. Shadow sat at his heel, 6 years old and steady, his black and tan coat drying in uneven patches, amber eyes tracking every movement down the corridor. He was calm in the way only working dogs were calm, not relaxed, just ready. Daniel started with the paperwork because paperwork never lied the way people did. A records clerk named Luis Ramirez brought the file, mid-40s, stocky build, thinning hair, combed carefully to one side, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. Luis had the practiced politeness of someone who had seen too many families unravel over forms and signatures. He spoke softly, respectful, as if the documents themselves required discretion. The file confirmed what Daniel already suspected. Mark Whitman was Eleanor's legal guardian. His name appeared on multiple authorizations, medical consent, financial oversight, housing decisions. None of the signatures were forged. Eleanor had signed them herself months earlier, her handwriting careful, yet trusting. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Guardianship wasn't a crime. Exploitation was. Luis pointed out the most recent form, still unsigned, clipped neatly at the front. Power of attorney, broad authority, enough to move assets, redirect benefits, sell property. "This one hasn't gone through yet," Luis said, tapping the page with a blunt finger. "Needs her approval while she's deemed competent." He hesitated, then added, "Happens more often than people think." Daniel thanked him and watched the clerk retreat back into the maze of offices, carrying the weight of other people's lives in manila folders. Down the hall, a social worker named Karen Doyle waited with a tablet tucked under her arm. She was in her early 50s, tall, with short gray blonde hair and a face shaped by patience rather than softness. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Years working elder services had stripped her of illusions without stealing her resolve. Karen spoke plainly, without dramatics. Eleanor's benefits were substantial enough to attract attention. Her small brick house paid off decades ago sat in a neighborhood whose value had climbed quietly. There had been inquiries, a realtor, an investor. Mark's name appeared on the contact log. "Nothing illegal," Karen said. "Not yet," Daniel nodded. "Not yet" was often the space where damage was done. Security footage filled in the rest. A grainy clip from Grant Park showed Mark pushing Eleanor's wheelchair into a darker section of the path, shoulders squared, head angled away from the camera. Another camera caught him minutes later in the parking lot, moving quickly, keys already in hand. He didn't look back. The timestamp told its own story. Daniel watched the clip twice, once without sound, once with the faint echo of wind through cheap speakers. Shadow shifted beside him, ears lifting at the sight of the man on screen, and a low vibration forming in his chest, not a growl recognition. Daniel took Shadow outside to the employee lot, snow crunching underfoot. He didn't prompt the dog. He didn't need to. Shadow moved with quiet certainty, nose sweeping low, tail stiff. He paused near a blue sedan dusted with fresh snow, circled once, then sat. A clean indication. Daniel marked the plate number and radioed it in. The car wasn't stolen. It was registered to Mark Whitman, parked less than a mile from where Eleanor had been left. Close enough to watch, close enough to wait. Back inside, Daniel checked Eleanor again. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, confusion crossing her face before recognition settled in. She asked about her house, about Mark. Daniel answered carefully, choosing truth without cruelty. "We're looking into some things," he said. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if a part of her had already known. To trust was not the same as blindness, he realized. Sometimes it was just hope wearing thin. As night pressed on, Daniel compiled his notes. Guardianship papers, pending power of attorney, real estate inquiries, vehicle proximity, camera footage. Individually, they were ordinary. Together, they formed a pattern too clean to be accidental. He felt the old familiar pull of anger, but he held it back. Anger rushed. Evidence endured. Shadow lay down at last, head on his paws, eyes still open. Daniel rested a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the warmth and solidity of something that did not deceive. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footprints even as it preserved the truth beneath them. Daniel closed the file and exhaled slowly. This was no mistake born of carelessness. Someone had planned to let Winter finish a job they were too cowardly to complete themselves, and plans, Daniel knew, always left paper behind. Mark Whitman arrived at the Southside Hospital just after midnight, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his wool coat, as if he had stepped in reluctantly from the cold rather than rushed through it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture naturally confident, but tonight that confidence sagged under strain. His dark hair, usually neat, was damp and slightly disordered, and a thin line of stubble darkened his jaw, giving his face a sharper, more desperate edge. And his eyes darted too often, scanning hallways, watching reflections in glass, the behavior of a man already rehearsing explanations. When he spoke, his voice carried urgency, softened with practiced concern. He asked for Eleanor by name, said he had been frantic with worry, apologized repeatedly to nurses and staff, as if politeness alone might absolve him. Officer Daniel Carter watched from the end of the corridor, arms folded, expression unreadable. Years on the force had taught him that guilt rarely announced itself loudly. It leaked out in gestures, timing, and contradictions. Mark's apology came too late and too clean. Shadow stood beside Daniel, body still but tense, hackles slowly rising as Mark drew closer. The dog's amber eyes fixed on him with unwavering focus. Shadow did not bark. He did not lunge. He growled low in his chest, a sound born not of aggression, but certainty. Mark stopped mid-step, and his gaze flicking briefly toward the dog before snapping back to Daniel. Mark claimed Eleanor was confused, that she sometimes forgot things, that the cold must have disoriented her. He spoke quickly now, hands moving as if shaping the story in the air. He said he had only stepped away for a moment to take a phone call, that when he returned she was gone, that he had been searching for her ever since. Daniel let him talk. He noticed how Mark never once asked how Eleanor was doing. Daniel stepped forward and placed a tablet on the counter between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply turned the screen so Mark could see. The security footage began to play, grainy, color muted, but unmistakable. Mark pushing the wheelchair into the darker stretch of Grant Park. Mark walking away alone minutes later. The timestamp glowed coldly at the bottom of the frame. Daniel followed it with a printed timeline. Patrol logs, ambulance dispatch, hospital intake. Yes, and then came copies of the paperwork guardianship records, pending power of attorney, notes from a realtor. Each page landed softly, deliberately, like snow settling before a collapse. Mark's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried again, laughter breaking through thin and brittle. He said it looked bad, admitted that maybe he had made a mistake, but insisted there was no malicious intent. Shadow's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the quiet hallway. Mark took a step back, heels sliding slightly on the polished floor. His eyes moved again this time, toward the exit. Daniel saw the decision settle over Mark like a switch being thrown. Mark turned suddenly and ran. The hospital doors burst open into the night, cold air rushing in as Mark sprinted toward the parking lot. Snow fell harder now, flakes thick and blinding, the city lights smearing into halos. Daniel took off immediately, boots slipping once before finding traction, and Shadow surged forward, leash snapping free as Daniel released it, trusting the dog's training and instinct. The world narrowed to motion and breath. Mark weaved between parked cars, shoes skidding on ice, panic stripping away coordination. Shadow closed the distance fast, powerful muscles driving him forward, his bark sharp and commanding now, echoing off concrete and steel. Mark stumbled near his blue sedan, catching himself against the hood. Shadow was there in an instant, positioning himself between Mark and the open driver's door, teeth bared but controlled, his stance flawless. Daniel arrived seconds later, breath burning in his chest, snow plastered to his uniform. He didn't hesitate. He pulled Mark's arms behind his back, the metal of the cuffs cold and final as they snapped shut. Mark sagged, resistance gone, breath coming in ragged bursts. Snow gathered on his shoulders, as if the night itself were reclaiming him. Daniel read him his rights, voice steady, despite the rush still pounding in his ears. Shadow remained alert until Daniel signaled, then stepped back, tension easing, but eyes never leaving Mark's face. Inside the hospital, Eleanor slept, unaware that the man who had left her to the cold now stood cuffed beneath the same falling snow. The city moved on around them, traffic humming in the distance, windows glowing warm. But for this small pocket of time, the noise of Chicago faded. Justice did not arrive with ceremony. It came with evidence, restraint, and a dog who refused to ignore what others might have missed. As officers arrived to take Mark into custody, Daniel looked once more toward the hospital doors, then down at Shadow. The dog's tail gave a single, slow wag. The night had not ended the way Mark planned, and Winter had failed to finish his work. Winter loosened its grip, not all at once, but quietly, the way mercy often arrives. By morning, Eleanor Whitman had been transferred from the hospital to a long-term care center on the outskirts of the city, a low brick building framed by bare trees and clean sidewalks cleared before dawn. Sunlight reached her room through wide windows, pale but steady, warming the quilt pulled to her chest. A new coat hung on the back of a chair, heavy wool, a charcoal gray beside a pair of thick gloves folded with care. When Eleanor noticed them, her hands trembled less. Her shoulders, once collapsed inward, as if bracing for the cold forever, eased back an inch at a time. Sarah Morales introduced herself softly at the bedside. She was in her early 40s, slim and tall, with dark hair threaded with silver pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Her skin held the tired warmth of someone who spent her days listening to other people's grief, and her eyes were attentive without being intrusive. Sarah spoke with patience, learned over years in social services, a profession that had worn lines into her face but sharpened her resolve. She explained the plan medical oversight, legal advocacy, counseling, and then paused, giving Eleanor space to ask questions. Eleanor's voice was still fragile, but it held something new now, certainty that someone would answer. Officer Daniel Carter visited later that afternoon, uniform crisp, posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been days before. He brought no flowers, no ceremony, just himself and Shadow. The German shepherd moved with measured calm through the hallways, nails clicking softly, ears alert but respectful. At 7 years old, Shadow carried the composed authority of experience, black and tan coat glossy even under fluorescent lights, and amber eyes observant and steady. He stopped beside Eleanor's wheelchair and sat without command, tail resting against the tile. Eleanor reached out. Shadow leaned in, accepting the touch as if it had always belonged there. Daniel didn't linger. He spoke briefly, how she was safe, how the investigation was proceeding, how she wouldn't be alone anymore. He avoided promises he couldn't keep, but the ones he made were solid. When he left, Eleanor watched the door close and realized she wasn't counting minutes anymore. Mark Whitman's case moved forward with the unglamorous precision of paperwork and courtrooms. The evidence was unambiguous. The footage, the forged forms, the attempt to sell what was not his to sell. There were charges, hearings, consequences measured in months and years. Daniel followed protocol and then let it go. He had learned long ago that carrying every outcome home would hollow a person out. Justice, when it arrived, didn't need him to stand guard over it forever. Back on patrol, Chicago resumed its familiar rhythm. Sirens stitched the night together. Trains sighed along the elevated tracks. Daniel worked his shifts with the same attention as always, but something had shifted. Each time he and Shadow passed Grant Park, he slowed a fraction, not from doubt, but remembrance. The park looked ordinary again. Benches dusted with old snow, paths cleared, lamps humming. It would be easy to forget what had happened there. Daniel refused to. Shadow sensed the change too. He remained vigilant, but his body language softened, the edge replaced by confidence. He had done what he was trained to do, and what he chose to do. In quiet moments, Daniel scratched behind Shadow's ears and felt the dog lean into the contact, content without sentimentality. Partnership, not reward. Weeks passed. Eleanor's routine took shape: morning light, physical therapy, tea in the afternoon. Sarah checked in often, her presence steady, her notes meticulous. A volunteer named Mr. Halverson retired, stooped, with a gentle smile read aloud from the paper on Tuesdays. Eleanor listened and sometimes laughed, surprised by the sound of it. When Daniel returned one final time to drop off documents, Eleanor met him with her chin lifted. "I'm warm," she said, as if it were a verdict. Winter did not end that day. Snow still fell. Wind still cut along the lake. But something else stopped the idea that indifference was inevitable. In a city that prided itself on momentum, a pause had mattered. One person had stopped. One dog had refused silence. A life had been pulled back from the edge. On a late shift, Daniel stood at the park's edge and watched pedestrians hurry past, collars turned up, minds elsewhere. He understood the pull to keep moving. He also understood the cost. Shadow sat at his side, breathing slow, eyes scanning the dark with patient care. Chicago kept going. And because someone had stopped once, it did so with one fewer ghost in the snow. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a stranger who chooses to stop, a loyal dog who refuses to be silent, or a moment when God places someone exactly where they are needed most. In a cold city night, Grace found a woman who had been left behind, and it reminded us that no life is ever invisible to Him. If you're watching this today and carrying loneliness, fear, or exhaustion, remember this: God sees you even when the world rushes past. Help often comes in ordinary forms, but it arrives at the exact moment it is meant to. Hold on. Keep keep believing. You are not forgotten. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people God intends them for. May God bless you, protect you, and bring warmth to your life, just as He did on that winter night. Wherever you are, may peace find you, and may love never pass you by.